The Golden Goose Award, we have found, is a wonderful way for us to tell stories of how scientific breakthroughs happen. Each is a story with a journey, with challenges and hurdles, personal doubts, heroism, yes, every one of these, and ultimately an enlightening outcome. From helping us to better understand our brains, to revolutionizing our understanding of the immune system, to illuminating how cells communicate. This year's awardees are wonderful examples of how science works. And that is what this is about, telling the stories behind the scientific breakthroughs so every American can see what it means to think like a scientist and delight in the discovery. The Golden Goose winners have a fuller measure of persistence and courage to stand up to the ridicule that often accompanied their work and the slings and arrows of small minds. This year's Golden Goose awardees are great examples of curiosity and determination and ingenuity, and how those can lead to incredible, and I don't use that word lightly, incredible discoveries. In fact, they were so incredible, in most cases people said, this is not research worth doing. But the researchers have shown that indeed it is and was. I can tell you from my 16 years in Congress that this effort to tell stories like this is really important and can be really influential because policymakers, like all of us, value stories. And because we must tell those stories so that science can have the support it needs to advance and to benefit society. AAAS is proud to be leading the effort today, and I think long into the future as part of our mission to be the force for science. Many folks on my staff, as well as in our partner organizations, have worked hard to make this happen. I'd particularly like to acknowledge the co-chairs of the Golden Goose Award Steering Committee, Aaron Heath and Julia Smith. And I can't wait to hear, and I can't wait for you to hear, the awardees reflect on their stories and the awards. And now I'd like to introduce the MC for the evening, Mr. Frank Sesno.
Thank you very much, Rush, and thank you for your leadership and for the talk and the passion for the story. That's what I do. I'm at George Washington University now, and I direct the School of Media and Public Affairs after many years with CNN and elsewhere in the media, the other media from the other time. Right? But it is all about stories. It's about informing and engaging and inspiring through stories. And that's why I'm so thrilled to be here tonight and look forward to it so much. This is the 5th time I've had the privilege to MC this ceremony. I teach a class on sustainability reporting, and today we were talking about how we take science and make it merely fascinating in the way we build narratives around it. The Golden Goose Awards celebrates powerful stories, but stories sometimes that come from silly-sounding science that has returned very serious benefits to society. So tonight we'll honor 3 teams of researchers whose federally funded work may have seemed silly, odd, obscure at the time, but led to very significant benefits for society, benefits in many cases that we have all taken advantage of and that holds great power and promise for the future. Nominations for the Golden Goose Awards can come from anyone. So if you have a story to tell, please share it at goldengooseaward.org. I'll give that to you again, goldengooseaward.org. Nominations are evaluated by a very distinguished panel of scientists and science professionals who comprise the Golden Goose Award Selection Committee. Now, in addition to the founders whom Rush listed, the Golden Goose Award is supported by many other organizations and institutions without whose backing this night, this award, this recognition this powerful story that we'll tell here would be impossible. So I'd like to thank those sponsors whose support has made the 2018 awards what it is. The Golden Goose Award benefactor organization is Elsevier, which made a generous multi-year commitment in 2015. This year's partner organization is United for Medical Research. This year's friend organization is the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And this year's contributing organizations are Sage Publishing, the American Mathematical Society, the Association for Psychological Science, the Association of American Medical Colleges, the Association of American Universities, Battelle, and IEEE USA. We also appreciate the support of many of the supporter organizations listed in your program. Would you join me, please, in thanking all of these organizations that make this possible? I was told to avoid, if possible, cliches and puns about the weather, given the moment, but given the winds that are blowing, the Golden Goose Award has always had strong bipartisan support in Congress, and we're pleased to have several of our congressional supporters here tonight. We're going to ask each of them to come up and say a few words and offer their reflections on the power and the promise of science and our awards. I'm pleased to lead us off to invite up Congress's only physicist. Think about that. Congress's only physicist, a steadfast champion for federal investment in scientific research and STEM education. Please join me in welcoming from the great state of Illinois, Congressman Bill Foster.
Well, good evening, and thank you all for being here to support this important effort and to honor the work of these remarkable scientists. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Congressman Bill Foster, and I represent the 11th District of Illinois, and I guess tonight I'm proud to represent the first in a parade of members of Congress who are speaking fast and running for the airport to avoid the storm. But before coming to Congress, I was a high-energy particle physicist and accelerator designer for 25 years, working at Fermi National Accelerator Lab. Now, before that, I started a company in my basement with my younger brother that now makes most of the theater lighting equipment in the U.S. And so that background is one of the many reasons why I'm excited to be here at this event this year, because I know firsthand the value of research and development and unexpected discovery has on our profession and our country's economic development. Curiosity-driven research has increasingly come under threat, and I worry a lot about the effect that this trend has on our young researchers and those who are just starting their careers. It's curiosity and thinking in new ways that lead to new groundbreaking solutions to serious problems. And we need sustained federal funding to make those solutions possible. The Golden Goose Award is a perfect opportunity to remind members of Congress and everyone why federally funded research is so important. Now, we usually have this discussion in terms of teaching politicians lessons from science, but there are times also when science can provide analogies that help us understand our political system. And so if you'll bear with me for a moment, I'll try to explain. There have been breakthroughs in anti-aging research in the last decade or two having to do with what are called senescent cells. These are cells that are frozen partway along the programmed death pathway. So they're not dead yet, but they're actually not doing their job anymore, and they excrete chemicals that causes the nearby cells and the whole organism to act old. So if you think about these senescent cells, they're not doing their job, they're not dead yet. They're really, there's a close analogy there with the Senate of the United States of America. But biological analogies can go very deeply in other directions as well. I mean, for example, one can analyze, the current Trump administration and particularly the administration budgets from Mick Mulvaney and the OMB. It's really a reflection of an autoimmune disorder of our democracy. Well, if you think about, this is when, the normally healthy skepticism about government runs amok and starts attacking the healthy tissue of our government. And so, thinking deeply about these and, I think has some benefit. And in those terms, you can think of the Golden Goose Award as a powerful immunosuppressant agent to actually, try to reverse that dangerous autoimmune disorder. And there are many examples. For example, one of my favorites is that federal research into quantum computing actually led to antenna designs that have applications in RFID tagging that are revolutionizing logistics, which is hardly what was planned when you wrote your proposal for your quantum computing. And the list of that sort of, just wonderfully unexpected discovery is enormous. And that's why it's really important as we gather here tonight to remember the uncertainty that's always faced in scientific experiments. You're trying to discover something new and you don't know what you'll find. And very often you find things that are wonderful for science and for our whole country. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I can hear it now. Senator Senescent, has a certain ring. Next up is a member of Congress who is a champion for building the next generation of girls in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. She co-chairs the Congressional STEAM Caucus, which supports STEM and the arts, which is what the A stands for. We're thrilled to have Representative Elise Stefanik of New York here with us today. Congressman.
Thank you so much, Frank, for that kind introduction. I am so excited to be here today, and as Frank mentioned, I'm the proud co-chair of the STEAM Caucus. My co-chair across the aisle, Suzanne Bonamici from Oregon, is also here today, so it's great to partner on this. This is a true honor. This is my first year at this event, and my former colleague, Bob Dold, invited me to join the Golden Goose, the gaggle of supporters, so I am very proud to join this very powerful gaggle. I am more proud, though, that this Congress is committed in a bipartisan basis to investing in research, whether it's the $40 billion to the NIH, whether it's our focus on removing barriers that stand in the way of modern treatments, and our commitment to advancing personal medicine to ensure that patients can be treated based on their unique circumstances. I wanted to highlight 3 amazing research stories that I thought are quite compelling. These are previous recipients of the Golden Goose Award. One was given in 2016, research conducted in my district. This was the honeybee algorithm, research conducted by Cornell University, who is somewhere in the audience today. It was conducted in Cranberry Lake, and it was scientists that studied bees' patterns for a period of 15 years. And their research ultimately led to these amazing breakthroughs when it came to logistics and computer science. So I'm so proud to have research conducted in my district. The second research breakthrough I wanted to focus on, I'm one of the few millennials in Congress, and in 2014, we awarded research into black holes and supercomputing. This was research that went back to the 1980s, but it led to an influx of supercomputing resources and the first commercialized web browser, Netscape Navigator. Even I remember that as a millennial. And lastly, as a young woman, I wanted to highlight another recipient. The rat massage research helps premature babies. This was a discovery resulting from experiments rubbing or massaging rat pups, led to a momentous change that I've heard from many of my fellow young women who have just given birth, some of my friends who are new moms, and it helps premature babies how they're cared for, and this has truly saved lives. So the research that these scientists conduct is so important. It's so important for the future of our country, and I'm so proud to be here to support you. Thank you.
Bravo, and as a proud father of a daughter who is now in marine science as a graduate student at the University of Hawaii and has talked many times about the value of women models and the encouragement that has come from government and elsewhere for her to make this, I just want to thank you. Thank you again. Next up, I'd like to invite on stage Congresswoman from Oregon, who serves on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, including as ranking member of the Environment Subcommittee. She co-chairs the STEAM Caucus with Ms. Stefanik. So welcome, please, Suzanne Bonamici.
It's great to be back. Silent frogs, the algorithm of honeybees, fluorescent jellyfish, rat massage, the goose gland. Now, when my constituents at my town hall meetings ask me where federal dollars are going, that's what I can tell them. But these may not sound serious, but we know they all led to significant discoveries, and that's why the Golden Goose Awards are so important, to highlight why we need federal research even when the benefits are not known at the outset. So I want to thank the Father Goose, I think we call it, Congressman Jim Cooper, the AAAS, and all of the sponsors for the 7th Annual Golden Goose Awards. Now, in that kind introduction you heard, I serve on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, but I also serve on the Education and Workforce Committee with Representative Stefanik. And we have some big challenges to face as a country. And we know we need critical thinkers, we need problem solvers, we need innovators. So I founded and chair with Representative Stefanik the STEAM Caucus, because we know that when arts are integrated into STEM learning, we're engaging both halves of the brain. We know that scientists are also musicians, painters, and poets. I always think about Leonardo da Vinci. We know that the Nobel-winning scientists are more likely to be involved in the arts. Integrating arts into STEM means more creativity, and as Representative Foster talked about, curiosity. We want to educate the next generation to not just know how to answer questions, but to know what questions to ask. So that's why we're working with the National Science Foundation on a bipartisan proposal to support more STEAM education. And that's why we're here today saying thank you and congratulations to the curious, bold scientists who are the award winners tonight. We're proud to support your research today, proud to support research of future Golden Goose Award winners in the future, even when we don't know what the outcome is at the outset. So again, congratulations to all of the award winners. I look forward to hearing your stories and telling them along with the stories of the past years. Congratulations again.
Father Goose. It sort of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Representative Jim Cooper of Tennessee, as a young member of Congress, could not understand why Senator Bill Proxmire, a few of you in the room remember Proxmire? Yes? Would confer his Golden Fleece Award for wasteful federal spending on scientific research. He thought we should honor scientists and their curiosity, not ridicule them. He urged the founding organizations to create a Golden Goose Award, and it's thanks to his vision and persistence that the Golden Goose Award is now in its 7th year, and that we convene here to celebrate curiosity-driven science and these wonderful effects. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Father Goose, Jim Cooper.
Thank you so much, Frank. I am deeply honored to be with you tonight. This is one of the best nights of the year, regardless of the weather. And we're meeting in the greatest library in the world to celebrate something we should be celebrating, science. I'm deeply grateful for my colleagues being here, Representative Stefanik, Bonamici, Representative Foster. The auditorium should be full of my colleagues. Now, the weather is a reason tonight, but on other nights, sometimes my colleagues are AWOL when it comes to supporting science. You know, I serve on the Armed Services Committee. Our first duty is to defend the country. But we should fund science so we have a country worth defending. This is knowledge for the world, knowledge for the future of humanity. It's true, as Frank said, I was terribly frustrated with the cheap shots that Bill Proxmire was taking against scientists, because it's easy to ridicule. But it's more important to achieve, and that's what so many of you in the audience have done, past recipients, the current crop, and most important, the future crop of recipients. Because your knowledge, your genius, your expertise, married with taxpayer funding, yields incredible, unforeseen, serendipitous results. And I'm so thankful for that, and I want young people to grow up dreaming big dreams, being willing to do the impossible, but it takes research money. It takes resources to make that happen. And that's the job of your elected officials, to try to produce those funds so that we can maintain our world leadership in so many of these fields. I'm a little worried right now. Not only is there an anti-science sort of mood in parts of the country, I'm a little worried that sometimes we end up being our own worst enemies. And I'm going to focus just for a minute on the health sciences, not as effectively as my colleague Bill Foster did, but what I see is more and more disease advocacy groups, each one of whom cares deeply about the disease that has afflicted their family member. And I'm not in any way minimizing their grief or their hardship. But there's an increasing fragmentation. And I could almost spend all day, every day, just hearing disease advocates. And meanwhile, my colleagues are tempted politically to fund some of the activities that involve the largest afflicted population. Think of what would happen if we reverse that. Because virtually every industry that lobbies us comes to us unified, holding hands, pretending they love each other. Then they go fight like cats and dogs once they leave Washington. But I have disease advocacy groups in my office who won't even be nice to each other in the anteroom because they're afraid that if they get more money for one, then there'll be less money for somebody else. When the truth is, we're the richest country in the history of the world, and we should be able to fund all of these needs. And see, if the disease advocacy groups were unified, then instead of them coming to Washington to beg us, sometimes for pennies, or to beg us, oh, don't cut our budget, then Congress people would be outbidding each other to see how big we could raise the NIH budget or some of these other budgets. That's what I see my colleagues do at conventions for other industries, because when they're united, we come forward and say, hey, I can help you more than this guy can. So I want us to consider in no way diminishing the disease advocacy groups as individuals, but one day a year allowing them to unite. And then Congress would fly to wherever they were meeting and say, hey, I can do more than $40 billion for you in the NIH. I can do, so raise the ante. Because in the big scheme of things, these numbers, even the billions, are budget dust. This Congress increased the debt by over $1.5 trillion this year just with one bill, with hardly any notice in the newspapers. $1.5 trillion, and only scientists understand these orders of magnitude. Politicians don't. So there's an opportunity here, not only to school us in scientific notation, many of which my colleagues need a little remedial course on that. 3 orders of magnitude, it's hard for us to get around our head. And maybe we need to redo the English language so that million, billion, and trillion aren't so typographically close to each other. They should be universes apart. But thank you to the Goose sponsors, my former colleague Rush Holt in particular, but to all the sponsors. And there's a former staff member of mine, Zach Marshall, who's actually the key implementer of all of this. He was willing to go around to all the scientific groups and sell the idea to create the impossible, because there are all sorts of bureaucratic hassles and some jealousies in Washington. And he made it happen, and on a bipartisan basis. He now works for another colleague of mine, John Yarmouth. But Zach is a true hero in this process. But all of you are heroes by combining your genius with federal funding to come up with the future. Thank you.
Words to live by. Thank you very much. Well, we have another tradition here, which we're going to draw your attention to. It's the Golden Goose video. This introduces you to our 2018 Golden Goose Awardees. It tells their stories, a little bit of their stories. A number of organizations helped make this video possible. I'd like to give particular thanks to the American Society for Microbiology and Vanderbilt University for their support. Here you go.
Like the fabled goose that laid the golden egg, federally funded scientific research has yielded extraordinary yet unexpected returns. Out of odd-sounding, obscure beginnings have come many amazing advances that have improved each of our lives. The Golden Goose Award recognizes the people and the stories behind these unexpected and incredible scientific breakthroughs.
Dr. Bruce Glick, when I say that name, I get the goosebumps, Glick had this incredible persona. He's a throwback to the old days, the Renaissance man, driven by curiosity, is willing to share, is willing to mentor, is willing to give. But really it was Bruce Glick's work in discovering the functionality of chickens that contributed to where we are today.
It didn't matter what he was doing, he just gave it his 110%. And that was his attitude. He could do anything he put his mind to. That's how he got into the poultry science part of this, because his professor at University of Massachusetts, the guy looked at him like, "You're a city guy. You've never even worked on a farm before." And he said, "Well, I'll work on a farm." And he was like, "You can't work on a farm. You don't know anything about it." Well, he proved them wrong. I didn't realize until much later on exactly how important his work was.
It was a serendipitous discovery that he made that this particular organ called the bursa fibrosus that's located in the rear end of chickens is the basis of humoral immunity. Humoral immunity is really what we refer to as antibodies. So nobody knew what it was. They just thought, it's an organ that's out there. Who cares? Nobody cared for 300 years until Bruce Glick comes along. You can harken back to the early 1950s, and him and his colleagues, they attempt to send this particular paper describing this foundational discovery to Science magazine. The editors sent back a note that this was uninteresting, and then he goes on to publish it in the Journal of Poultry Science. It becomes a citation classic, and the Poultry Science Society of America actually designates Dr. Glick's work as the most foundational in poultry science. Not only was his science foundational for knowledge about chickens and geese and turkeys, but also for human health and well-being. It is at the basis of what we do today in terms of cancer treatments and the development and deployment of vaccines.
It's helping in rheumatology, it's helping in childhood cancers.
That sort of a treatment that's happening in the year 2018 would not have been possible without that foundational, seminal work that was done by Bruce Glick and all the others that came along after him.
The best way to think about implicit bias is that it's a collection of all the experiences that we have in the world. We have a certain kind of brain. It has learned to detect information in the world as it sees it, store it, and not have to recompute every time. But it turns out our brains are screwed up in that they don't learn accurately.
In the late 1980s, we started a line of work which became the work on implicit social cognition.
Most of the implicit bias work that we did to start was about social groups, how it is that I might perceive people based on gender or age or race or sexual orientation and make judgments about them, not even necessarily intending to. I don't have to ask you how you feel about racial groups or gender groups. Instead, I just measure that indirectly. How easily can you associate black faces with good words compared to white faces with good words?
The first test I ever took was a race test. I know who I am. I'm the great Mazarine, the egalitarian who's been teaching about all of this stuff. I can associate white and black equally with good and bad. So I do it. White and good, black and bad. Easy peasy. I switch. And my brain has just slowed down.
First of all, I was shocked to discover that I had in me something I wasn't aware of.
It put us in a 2x2 box and didn't let us escape. It said, Mazarine, sit here and confront this. And so the first studies we did were at Yale and at University of Washington on our own students. And then in 1998, we began to worry that maybe people will write this off by saying, oh, college students, who cares?
And so I started to make pitches to Mazarine and Tony saying we could put this on the internet.
We were expecting that we'd put the test up and maybe 500 people would show up in the first year. And in the first month, we had 45,000 completed tests. And in that moment, I knew the horse has left the barn.
We didn't know that we were working on something that could prove practically important.
There are many organizations now that want to confront this. Police departments, military, which have been moving to understand these issues in a wonderful way. So much really good work has already been done that it gives us the luxury now of taking a step back and asking one interesting question, and that is, how do we change ourselves?
To be a scientist is like being a spy. Only instead of spying on the enemy, you're spying on nature. Nature has secrets, and she doesn't want to give them up. What we were interested in was just basic immunology at the time. This was back in the mid-20th century. It was only recently at that time that people actually discovered that the immune system involved more than just making antibodies.
The trick is to find that one or two things that don't fit correctly, realize that there's something missing that you don't understand, that we don't know yet, and that's what expands our scientific knowledge. Stan was really good at this. This was an amazing thing. He just saw something didn't quite make sense, and he had the wherewithal to pursue it and design experiments to actually come up with this.
We found that all these things have in common is that they allow cells to do things to other cells. And I'll bet you that that's part of not only defense against disease like in the immune system, but it's part of the general physiology of the body. Nothing is real until you name it. And so I call them cytokines. And that's how it began.
This was against all the standard theory.
No one believed it. We found it very difficult to get it published. After about 2 or 3 years, it caught on as a concept. The cytokines are basically the vocabulary that cells use as part of their language in talking to each other, and allows it to interact with other cells.
So this is a new way of thinking about how to treat cancer patients. And we can now do that by using all these unique cytokines.
People think of scientific discovery as climbing up a telephone pole, and you're going to get something at the top of it. It doesn't work that way. Discovery is like a tree. New things keep popping up along the way, and they create branches. And then you have to explore the branches. And every once in a while, you'll find a branch with a lot of nice fruit, but you don't know in advance which branch it is. It's those new unexpected discoveries that actually lead to big, useful findings. Luckily, the government has gotten very good at understanding this, and there are a number of grants that are given specifically for what is called high gain, high risk. In other words, we don't really know if it's going to work, but if it does work, you're on the trail of something completely new and original.
Federal funding is important. This research would not have gotten started without it.
You need to prove to people that there is something worth pursuing.
So that's a little bit of a chicken and an egg, or a goose and an egg. How do you get the preliminary findings without the funding to do the research? And how do you get the funding to do the research without the preliminary findings?
We were extremely fortunate to have something called the National Science Foundation. I'd like to believe that there were some visionary people on that committee that said, this looks interesting. Let's give them a little bit of money to see what they can do. And that's the reason we're here today.
And so the real value to me of that federal support is really on fundamental science, of looking at questions that are important to investigate just for knowledge's sake.
You can't plan this out. You stumble into it. The question is, do you have the sense to recognize that you're onto something interesting?
If you're going to stumble, stumble big. Well, without further ado, let me pull this up here because I don't want to stumble on my microphone. There we go. Without further ado, we'd like to bring our 2018 awardees up, present them with these beautiful Golden Goose Awards, which we hope they will display prominently and proudly. First, we're going to invite AAAS CEO Rush Holt and Congressman Jim Cooper to hand out the awards. Doesn't get better than that. First recipients of the 2018 Golden Goose Awards are Drs. Mahzarin Banaji, Anthony Greenwald, and Brian Nosek for their work on implicit bias, which you saw here. Biases we don't know we have, a once surprising concept that has now found its way into boardrooms, classrooms, hospitals, police forces, as we heard, and more. The team found a novel way to research implicit bias by putting that test online during the early days of the internet. That test has now been taken by millions. Mahzarin, Tony, Brian, please come up. Picture? You got one? She got one, okay.
You got them? Oh, you got them.
Okay, you may take your seats. Our second award this year goes to Dr. Stanley Cohen, who first observed evidence of what he named cytokines. We're going to hear about that. Small proteins that cells use to communicate with each other. In a very unexpected setting, chicken eggs. Cytokines, as you've learned, have since led to new therapeutic approaches to cancer and autoimmune diseases. Stanley, join us. Congratulations. Our final awardee is the late Dr. Bruce Glick, whose research really cannot be beaten in this setting because, as you've heard, it involved, wait for it, a goose. Glick discovered the purpose behind this mysterious gland in the backside of a goose that's very dramatically named the bursa of Fabricius. The gland is linked to the immune system, and his work has shed light not just on the bird immune systems, but humanity and human immunity as well. Bruce's children, Daryl and BJ, are here with us to accept the award on their father's behalf. We welcome you to the stage. So now is the time that I always look forward to, which is when we get to have a chance to discuss and learn a little bit about our winners. So I will walk over this way. I don't get one of these, but I get a seat. And welcome to you all. Congratulations. Thank you. I mean, this curiosity thing is pretty good. So what I'd like to do is start with the Glick family here. Bruce and Glick, as we've seen, did some remarkable things, made a huge difference. Daryl, you said in that video that your dad went from city guy to farmer, and in fact, some of the people were saying, wait, what are you doing here? You've never been on a farm before. Can you talk a little bit more about that journey, how it happened, and how he related to that?
Well, he fell in love with birds when he was in the 4th grade. And he
fell in love with birds?
Birds.
When he was in the 4th grade?
Yeah, not chickens, but birds. Okay. It evolved into the chicken family, but he knew...
Oh, it's an evolution thing,
yes,
too. Okay.
That's what it was. But he knew that he wanted to know everything about it, about a bird, how it worked, and everything about it. And so when he was in graduate school, the study that he was in, he already knew everything. And he told the professor, I already know all this. I've identified 200 species of birds at this point in time. I know their migration patterns. I know everything about them. I want to change into a different field. And his professor said, no, you can't, unless you promise me you'll give me the next 3 years working on the farms in our school. And he said, okay.
So it was, you can change if you go to the farm.
If you go to the farms. And he was a Pittsburgh boy, Shadyside Academy boy. He'd never worked in the farm a day of his life, and he did. And he continued that when he went to Mississippi State. He took care of his chickens. He was the only one. And they had farm hands out there who would do that, but he took care of his chickens.
And this Bursa fabricius and the goose and all this kind of thing was dinner time
No. We didn't talk about that. We had to talk about what we did at school. We had to answer a lot of questions at the dinner table.
I see. Tell us more about your father and what he was like.
He was great fun to be around, I'll tell you that. He liked being outside. He would take us on birding trips on a regular basis. I mean, there wasn't a time that went by that there wasn't a bird feeder up in the yard, and there were birds coming to it. And at that time, there was no internet. So if something happened somewhere, someone would have to call on the telephone, right? So there'd be calls to the local Audubon Society when a bird came through, things like that. He fished, we canoed, we paddled. We did lots and lots of things together.
Kids don't appreciate what their parents are doing, maybe ever, but in your case, that's certainly not true. And you realized afterwards, as you went on in your life, the impact that your father's work had. How did you learn about that? And what do you make of it now?
Mainly his graduate students were the ones who told us when they would come to dinner, because he would have them all over all the time. We had them at Christmas, at Thanksgiving, just every weekend. He'd do a cookout in the backyard, and he didn't ever talk about himself. He was very humble and quiet and funny, but he never talked about himself at all. So we didn't know how the impact that his studies were having.
You talk about the graduate students coming to the house a lot, and one of the things that I know your father was known for, and was mentioned in the film too, was his constant mentoring. How did you see that, and how does that legacy persist?
Oh, he shared openly. He believed in, I guess, like open source software. He believed in sharing the wealth. His graduate students actually would take questions that he had. You know, they would wanted to do what he was doing, and he was basically saying, no, you know, the world's got me, they need you. You know, you might want to follow this branch of a tree, like you were talking about, Dr. Coleman. Follow this branch of the tree to see if the fruit's out there, you know, but it's on this one path. There are lots of paths around it. And so he would give those questions to his graduate students who would make careers out of it. And when he went to Clemson from Mississippi State, one of the conditions was that he taught a freshman class.
Wow.
Yeah.
And he did that and enjoyed it?
Yeah, loved it.
He taught graduate school at Mississippi State, but he taught a freshman incoming class at Clemson.
Yeah. Did you have pet geese?
We had 3 of them, actually.
Yeah, we did. Waddle and Dawdle.
Waddle, Dawdle, and Twaddle.
They're not very nice
But
creatures.
we loved them. Yes, they were.
They were?
They're like dogs.
Oh, I see. Just checking. I understand that one of your father's graduate students, I believe, is with us here today.
Where is
Bob
he?
Taylor. Is Bob here?
I wish he was up
Where
here.
is he?
Where is he?
There he is.
Yay.
Great thing to
His
mentor.
favorite graduate student. His favorite.
His favorite graduate.
Oh, yeah, teacher's pet.
But to all the other graduate students who are watching.
They're wonderful. We love them all. We love Bob.
Let's turn to implicit bias.
That's an explicit bias.
Let's see, I think your question was, how do we change ourselves? How did you first start working on this? What got you connected to this?
So I was in my first job at Yale in 1986, and everybody around me seemed to know what they were working on. And I was harboring this secret that I had no clue what I really wanted to do. And
really?
all I knew,
seriously?
Really didn't know. I had not landed on what it is that I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to study human memory. I had done some of that work with Tony in graduate school, but I really didn't carry it with me to then pursue. I knew it had to be something new. And in the course of reading on that topic, I discovered the work of a genius experimentalist by the name of Larry Jacoby, and he had done these beautiful studies showing that even though we may not actually be able to pull things out of our memories in a conscious way, that there might be some lingering evidence that there is that information in our head. And what he did was to figure out an indirect way of getting at that stuff. And so I wrote him, in those days when you wanted to replicate a study that somebody else had done, you would write them a postcard. And so I wrote, dear Dr. Jacoby, would you please, send me your materials? And his stimulus materials arrived in a big manila folder, and I opened them, and he had used names of people to do this research, and all the names were names of men. So I wrote him another postcard, and I said, dear Dr. Jacoby, I think you only sent me half the stimulus set. and he called me up on the phone and he said, we were doing a study on fame. Women aren't famous, so we didn't use any women's names.
He said that to you?
Oh, yeah. And not only did he say that to me, I said, oh, yeah, you're right. There are no famous women, so. But I don't know what got into me, but I spent the entire summer generating equivalently famous names of women, matching them, and
was
so
that
on.
all that difficult to do?
It was that you had to actually pre-test that for every famous man there was also an equivalently famous woman's name, and so on. Anyway, we did the study only to make sure that it was done with both kinds of names. That's all. I didn't expect really to see anything. And then when the data came in, I discovered that people's responses were such that they were identifying men's names to be famous incorrectly. This was a bias in memory. They were taking ordinary names, a name like Sebastian Weisdorf, and they were saying, that's a famous person. And
because it was
because they'd seen it before, because we had exposed, because it was lingering in memory and they couldn't tell why, but they felt that they could say that that name was famous. But they didn't do it for Sally Weisdorf, even though she was equally unfamous in our minds. And so I assumed in those days there was no concept of implicit bias, so I assumed people were doing what Larry said. There aren't many famous women, so there must not be. And so I would quiz individual subjects in the study and say, well, what led you to circle this name and not that name? And they would give me some theory, and it would never involve gender. So I said, well, do you think you might be using the gender of the name? And they were horrified that I would.
How dare you?
How dare you? Like, of course I didn't use gender of the name. Why would I do that? And this happened over and over again, enough that I began to think that they didn't know that they were using the gender of the name in their decisions. And it struck me as so much more interesting than just the memory issue. So this, again, was serendipitous in a sense. I didn't go looking for it, but it was there staring me in the face, and I had to decide whether to pursue that or keep doing what I was supposed to be doing. And I made the switch.
We're glad you did. Was there an aha moment or comment or data set that made you sort of see this so clearly?
It was in the informal conversations with people after they had finished the study.
Like what did they say?
When I would say why, how did you make your choices? And they would come up with really long stories about.
What?
They would say, well, you know, I assume that you showed me some names before. So they were getting into the Jacobi hypothesis pretty well. They were saying maybe because if I saw a name before, I might be inclined to think. Or they would just say, I think Sebastian Weisdorf is a Canadian hockey player. I'm pretty sure he is. Like, you know, but he wasn't. He was just a name we pulled out of the phone book. And so, yeah.
And he's thanked you for it ever since.
Yes, exactly.
Tony, what's the implicit association test and how'd you develop it?
The implicit association test is like a game that a computer plays with you and your mind. Your task is to classify words or pictures. You're just asked to make correct responses. But this provides a way of looking into a mind that hasn't been looked at by other methods, and it reveals knowledge that's evident in the speed with which you can make judgments under the conditions of the test. And so you can work backwards from the latencies, the times of responding, to construct a measure of associations telling you what is associated with what inside the head. That's the association test aspect of it. The implicit just means that it's an indirect measure. You're inferring it from something else rather than asking people what they associate with what. And Mahzarin and I were working on this class of problems and discovering things in the social psychology literature that were revealing evidence that people would make judgments about others or express attitudes. And if they were expressing it in self-reports, survey measures, they looked one way. And then if you look at the results of the experiments that are getting indirect measures, and it's showing other things. So we were looking for a way to test this, and the implicit association test, which we had unknowingly written into a grant to National Science Foundation in about 1992, not under that name, it had a very different name, but it was going to be a procedure that we were going to try out to see if it would measure what we were looking for. And I programmed the computer to do this. I went across the hall to my lab to run myself on the program, and the first test was with flowers and insects. Could it pick up a preference for flowers relative to insects? This is why I am wearing two ties today. This is the flower tie. This is the insect tie.
But because of your bias, the flower tie is on top?
Yes. And Mahzarin gave me these ties at a later date, and this is the first chance I've had to wear them in a public occasion. And you'll remember this because you don't see other people wearing two ties.
I want to know how you tied the knot.
Very cool.
So tell us what you would see or do at this computer when you would sit? I mean, if you sat me down, right, what would I be doing?
Well,
and see?
Okay, for the flower insect test, you've got 4 categories, which are flower names, insect names, and pleasant words and unpleasant words. And the trick of the test is to give you only 2 keys to identify those 4 categories. So you have to use the same key for either flowers and pleasant words or flowers and unpleasant words. The other key is then for insects and unpleasant or insect and pleasant. And it turns out when you're doing it one way with flowers and pleasant words on the same key, you just speed through it. Mazarine described this in the race test, which came later after the flower insect test. But first time I tried this, I had that experience. I was racing through it, and I switched the instructions. Now I have to give the same key to flowers and unpleasant words, and I slowed down. And not just a little slow down, but a big slowdown. And I said, I can see this is difficult. I'll have to practice it a little while. And the interesting thing was, practice it as much as I did, I could not get better at the difficult version of it in which I had to give the same response to insect names and pleasant words.
You joined the team in '96, is that right?
Yeah.
With your computer science background. So what did you bring to this process that helped scale it, I think would be the way you...
Yeah, so when I arrived, the intellectual agenda had been set. Mazarine and Tony had written sort of what is now thought of as the seminal paper, Introducing Implicit Social Cognition. And Tony had invented the IAT, and the initial studies had been done. So there was a phenomenon that everyone in the 2 labs recognized as something to pay attention to. And that just was something, there is a discovery. What is it? How do we understand it? And it was exciting to do. It was palpable as an experience. And for me, I think one of the main interests that I had from this stemmed from taking a low-tech version of this, which is putting on a deck of cards. So the 4 categories, as Tony described, you can, instead of 4 suits, you can have 4 deck of cards and have people sort them out into 2 piles as fast as they can. So we created a bunch of these 4 decks of cards. One summer, I went back to see college friends, and we're at a coffee shop and talking about, what are you doing now? What are you doing now in grad school? None of them are in science, but we're just talking about what we're doing.
Right.
And so I pull out a deck of cards. So this is what I'm doing. Say,
we like your professor.
Yeah, right. This is great. Yeah, and so one friend, Brian, does the sorting we did the race test, right? Put all the black faces and the bad words in this pile, put all the white faces and the good words in this pile. He goes fast. I shuffle up again. I say, okay, instructions have changed. Now you have to put the white faces and bad words in one pile. You have to put the black faces and the good words in the other pile. He says, fine. And he's going slow. And everybody else sitting around the table sort of watching him. And we stop, and one of the other friends says, give me those cards. We spend 4 hours in the coffee shop, right, with them saying, wait, what if it's the order that we did it? Let's do it in the other order. Oh, what if we change it this way? What if we turn these upside down? They became experimentalists for 4 hours trying to figure out how it is that this worked.
Did you say to them, or did they say to themselves, oh my God, I'm a racist and I didn't even know it?
That, and of course I'm not a racist, and the test is the problem. And of course this isn't me, this is coming out there from the culture, and every other explanation that one could think of. And that's what was wonderful about the test, is not just for its potential as an experimental tool, but its potential as an experiential tool. And so what I came back from that experience is that people will get something out of experiences. They'll learn something about fundamental science, not just of the science itself, but by the critical nature of how they can think about what the test actually means.
How many people have taken this test now, in one form or another, would you say?
Brian, give us the latest estimate.
It's probably about 30 million at this point. So we put it on, so it came back from this and said, we have to put this online.
So, and as you mentioned in the video, and we've said since, it's been done in boardrooms and classrooms and newsrooms maybe. And,
oh, yes.
Yeah.
And all other, and police departments and hospitals.
And by judges.
And by judges. when people experience this, is this common? And then it really does take, it would take me right to your question if I discovered this about myself. How do we change ourselves?
Right. So that's the hard question, and we are spending every minute of our waking lives on it in my lab right now, and there are dozens of other labs worrying about exactly the same issue. And not to simplify too much, but we know that we can change ourselves not just by willing ourselves to be different, because that doesn't work. It's been demonstrated that you can say to yourself, be a good person here, and you cannot change your performance on the test. But giving ourselves a different set of experiences, real experiences, we think can make a difference, even though the research is still left to be done. Listen up, federal agencies. The research is still to be done to demonstrate a set of things that we can do that will actually transform our minds, not in some elastic way. We know we can produce what I'll call elastic change. We can have people think about Barack Obama for a few minutes and show a change on the race test in a more positive direction towards African Americans. But that doesn't stick. When they leave the room and they've gone away, the brain just sort of snaps back to its default state. So we need to do research to figure out how to change ourselves so that in a more plastic sense we can remold ourselves to be what we would like to be rather than what we are, carrying the thumbprint of the culture on our brain.
Can we change ourselves?
I believe we absolutely can.
And does everybody react in the same way to these?
Oh yeah, the range is incredible.
The range is incredible, so not everybody is having
Oh yeah, so there are people who are, I think we should use this as a measure of IQ. How quickly do you figure out that it's your head that's screwed up, not the test that's screwed up? It took me very long to figure that out. But I think you get the entire range. I just have a piece of mail sitting in my mailbox that I haven't had the energy to respond to, written by a Black American who said, you know, your test is stupid because it showed that I have white preference and I know I don't. And so please stop doing this.
African American has a white preference.
Yeah, and is not happy about that. And you can and wrote very movingly about not only herself, but who are you people that you would do such a thing? This is not an easy experience. We have to engage with the public, and we write letters, and we are always sympathetic when people explain to us something very private like this. And over time, we've received dozens and dozens of incredible mail as well, telling us.
Well, you may have heard Masreen say that we don't know how to change this, and it may be unchangeable. In fact, we don't know how to change it now. This is something that should get research funding in the near future. It will take something that is unexpected now, actually, to find a way of doing this. Meanwhile, people who want to deal with this and the fact that discrimination and disparities can occur without intention have to find ways to control it so that they can't happen. One of the best examples is using a screen in front of an instrumentalist to audition for a symphony orchestra, which, when it was started in the 1970s in US and world major symphony orchestras, led rapidly to an increase in hiring of women as orchestral instrumentalists. Yeah, right. You didn't know whether you were looking at a man or a woman performing, and the performance was judged without the bias that men are virtuosos and women are not.
Just before I move over, I was struck by one other thing, and we haven't talked about it here. I think it's really important for you to mention it, and that is how this bears on suicide prevention.
So let me just start by saying that what Representative Cooper said about the families of people who have children with diseases and how hard it is to say to them, we need to invest in basic research because only by doing that will we eventually solve the problem, whether it's schizophrenia or cancer or whatever it might be. And we have to do that because if you had said to us, could the three of you sit down and solve the problem of suicide, we would have been absolutely incompetent at doing that. But this method actually was used by a colleague of mine, Matt Nock, to do studies on suicide prevention. How does it work? It will sound absolutely bizarre to you, but when people come into a hospital having reported that they have just made an attempt or a friend brings them in, we put a computer in the hospital with a clinician sitting there who would give them a test. And the test was simple, almost dumb. Me, not me. How do you associate yourself, or not yourself, somebody else, with life and death concepts? To live and to grow and to thrive, those concepts, versus to diminish and to die, and so on. And we got those measures from each person, and those were used to predict who's going to come back having made the next attempt at suicide. And if our test was valid, then the weaker your self-association to life, the more likely you should be to come back.
Yeah.
And that's what we found.
That's what you found.
That's not only what we found, but we found that this test predicted better than clinicians' report, better than the person's own reports, and better than any standard depression inventory. And so I use this example very much to say, if you want to solve these problems of these diseases, you can't just study the disease in a very direct, practical way. What you have to also do is invest in technologies and basic science that will have the propensity to eventually help us. And in fact, Matt Nock's work has now led the US Army to use this test to test every returning officer and after they come back from having done duty outside the country, to use it as a way of identifying people who may be at higher risk for committing suicide. And as we know, people who commit suicide and fail are close to 100% of them are really glad that they failed. So we know that this is extremely important for us to do. Yeah.
Dr. Cohen. Isn't this inspiring? I mean, it's just fabulous. Dr. Cohen, so you started your discovery with chicken eggs that you were about to throw away. You want to take us there? And scrambling wasn't good enough?
Actually, too much cholesterol. I have to do a little bit of a backstory, if you don't mind. When I was in medical school, immunology was perhaps the most boring subject you can possibly think of. It was about two things, antibodies and using antibodies to make vaccines. And then somewhere towards the end of medical school, I came across two very interesting papers. One of them was Bruce Glick's, when he discovered the bursa as being a source of one kind of lymphocyte. Another one was by Jacques Miller, who had discovered that the thymus is important. So suddenly we knew that there were two completely different kinds of immune cells, lymphocytes. We knew one of them made antibodies. We hadn't the foggiest notion of what the other one did. So then, as I was struggling through being a house officer, there were two guys independently, a guy named John David and another one named Barry Bloom. And they discovered that if you took the lymphocytes out of an animal that hadn't been immunized, dumped them in a test tube, added the antigen that they were immunized against, something got released into the medium, and that influenced the behavior, actually the migration of macrophages. And then there was a major flurry of activity describing all sorts of biologic effects in these molecules that were not antibodies. The only problem was that everyone thought that this was just an artifact of the test tube. And so what I wanted to work on was to prove that these were really important in the body, in humans, in mice, in guinea pigs. It's easier to take care of mice than guinea pigs, but we looked at all three. And in one tiny more digression, in order to understand how something happens in the body, a very good technique is to take and throw a monkey wrench into it and make it stop what's happening and then figure out what went wrong. And so I needed something to suppress the immune system. Fourth paper comes along, and there is a report that one virus, Newcastle disease virus, when it infected animals, would suppress their immune systems. So I said, great. So you grow them in eggs, so we got a lot of eggs, and we started infecting them with Newcastle disease virus, and we did that experiment. It didn't work. It just didn't work at all. It turns out that no one could reproduce that experiment. So here we are sitting around with lots of these fertilized eggs, and they're doing things. And I said, hey, you know, everyone thinks these substances are things that are important to the immune system. These eggs don't have an immune system. They don't have lymphocytes. Let's see what's inside them. And so we found that they turned out to have just about every kind of biologic activity that had been described for lymphocytes. So at that point, we had the notion, I had the notion that maybe every cell can do that. So we started using other things like kidney cells, and I can't even remember what, and every one of them did all those things. And so the jump, since I like to take jumps, was that this is really part of a regulatory system of the body. That these substances allow cells to tell other cells what to do. They're truly the language that cells use to talk to each other. And that's how it came about. And then we threw out the eggs.
So for those of us who haven't studied it in school or anyplace else, what is a cytokine?
Actually, what I just said, now that I think about it, is probably the best definition. The cytokine is part of the vocabulary of the language that cells use to talk to each other. A little more formally, they are small proteins that are made and released by cells. They work locally in the environment around the cells. They have multiple functions. And what they do is cause other cells to do things in lockstep, to be activated to do something, to differentiate into different cell types, to multiply, and occasionally program cell death. And so it's sort of a hormone-like system in which every cell is its own hormone.
And you said in the video that nothing is real until it has a name. You named it. Where did the name come from?
Okay. Cyto for cells, and at the time, kines because it just sounded good. But then someone pointed out to me, actually it's in the audience, Dr. Sobel pointed out that kine is like kinetic, implies movement, activity, motion, good things.
Oh, that's what you were thinking.
So that was my implicit bias.
There's a scientific journal called Cytokines.
Yes.
So tell us how they're being used today, and tell us where the research activity is surrounding them.
Well, where they're used today is again was mentioned, antagonists to cytokines are used to treat autoimmune diseases. You probably see all sorts of commercials on TV for biologicals, and if you have rheumatoid arthritis, ask your doctor if X is for you, and those are very often cytokine antagonists. They've been used in cancer. But there are a couple of areas that I think are really going to be exciting. The first of which is we're now in the era of personalized medicine and regeneration. And you can take an adult cell and dedifferentiate it into it and reconstruct it into any cell type you want and then use it. It turns out you can't do that without a cocktail of cytokines, and different cocktails of cytokines promote the differentiation to different cell types. So that's a biggie. What most intrigues me is that recently cytokines have been discovered in the brain. And it's not clear what they're doing, but there's a hint. It turns out that memory, in order to have long-term memory, we have to clean out the little memories we don't need anymore. And the brain does that by killing things, by pruning out synapses that are irrelevant. It's done through a cell type called an astrocyte. And I am betting about 100 to 1 odds that that's cytokine mediated as well. So those are some of the areas that I think are going to happen.
So interesting and exciting. All right. We've talked, and Rush and others have mentioned this frequently this evening, and this is sort of a jump ball question to you all, because I think we would almost be irresponsible not to ask it in a conversation like this, and that is, how fundamental to your work was federal funding. Would your work have happened if that had not been there? Would you have been able to get funding elsewhere or do it on your own?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, the simple answer is it would have been impossible.
Impossible?
The problem is that there are really only three sources, major sources of funding in the country. The federal government, industrial research, and philanthropic organizations. Again, I'll use a commercial I saw actually last night, put out by the American Pharmaceutical Council. And they show a pretty picture of a cell killing the cancer cell. And they then talk about 8 or so major breakthroughs in medicine that they are using to treat people. And the dirty little secret they don't tell you is that every single one of those breakthroughs came from federally funded research in universities. Industry doesn't really get involved in basic research because they're more concerned about return on investment. They do very good things, for example, scaling. Once you make a discovery, you really have to scale it up so that it can be used, and that sort of thing is good at. Industry is good at engineering. Philanthropy is really tremendously important, tends a little bit in most cases to be disease-focused, as one of the representatives mentioned to us. So aside from the sheer magnitude of the funding that the federal government does, they're the ones who really can push basic research. And the only other thing I do want to add is that basically, if you don't have basic research, it's like trying to grow a tree without planting a seed.
What about your dad?
Oh, for sure. I've heard him talk about it a little bit in kind of an abstract sense, but it does, he was able to do his research because he was curious about something. He had something, he wasn't sure what it was, but he had a gut feeling that it was important. How do you fund that? You can't fund that any other way. And everybody here's done that. I mean, everybody here's been on the edge of things, on the edge of failure. You could go one way or the other, and you did, didn't you? You were going to fail. Oh, no, I'm going to change. And would you have that kind of flexibility without that kind of funding? Probably not.
Honey?
We started our research with a grant from National Science Foundation. I had a good history of support previous years from National Science Foundation, not on this topic, so this was a change of topic. That grant was really important. I consider myself at the time, this was shortly after 1990, to have been a relatively young person. I was only in my early 50s at the time. And that was important. About a dozen years later, federal government stopped funding that sort of research because grants had switched to funding more applied stuff, and we were still doing basic science that had already generated the implicit association test. It's not clear to everyone what its importance would be. And I look around now and see young investigators trying to get these grants, and I know that it's a more competitive climate. It's not as easy for them to get funding as it was. It was difficult then, it's much more difficult now, and too many young scientists are looking to see what it is that the granting agencies will give support to now and say, I'll do research on that, rather than pushing their own ideas.
To that point, and there is a reception waiting, so I want to let you all get to that. But I'd very much like to ask each of you very briefly to address yourself to the young, the up-and-coming, the aspirational scientist out there. What is your advice? What would your father's advice be? And start at the end.
Well, it's easy to say follow your curiosity, given the themes of this. And I do think that that's true, because it leads in places that are unexpected. One of the interesting implications of actually finding something that's interesting, just to follow on in the comments that were just made on the previous point, is that once it is out of the bag, as Mazur left the barn, I don't remember what the phrase was in the video, but once it was out, there was a lot of additional responsibility that has come with trying to understand how to manage the knowledge of that, develop the knowledge and manage how it's used. And so one of the things I think that we've learned through experience of this is how much the excitement of trying to figure out how it works fundamentally can translate to others, their excitement, but then their very rapid excitement of wanting to apply it in many situations. And Mazrin described the example with suicide of a very interesting potential application. But then there's also lots of people that are taking implicit bias as a concept and applying it in many directions. And a lot of those don't have evidence yet. And so the importance of the fundamental support is to keep advancing that basic knowledge.
Keep advancing. Tony?
The research support is needed. I just completed writing a manuscript titled The Implicit Association Test at age 20. It's 20 years since publication. It'll be another 20 years before we've answered the questions that now appear important that have emerged on the basis of research. Funding to support that will be good. I'm hoping that philanthropic foundations are going to get into this in a big way because it's clear that the federal support needs to be supplemented. But I think federal agencies should still try to take leadership in stimulating, especially the younger scientists.
What's your advice?
To young people these days in science, we have to say something we didn't used to have to say, and that is, there is such a thing called truth. It is different from fiction, and your job is... And your job is to call out the bullshit when you see it.
Whoa! Now, it may be implicit bias, but when I saw your glasses, I knew I'd like you. What's your advice to young scientists?
I have a slightly different bias than you. I would, to someone in training, I would say don't only follow your curiosity. Find an area that you like, but within that area, don't necessarily pick the most exciting problem to you. Pick the scientist, pick the man or woman who's the smartest one you can find, because science is all about doing science, is learning how to think and how to approach problems and so on. And the other bit of advice is there are people who are good at mentoring and people who are not so good at mentoring, and try and find the best mentor you can find. Then when they get a little tiny bit older, I would say it's your job not only to find answers to questions, but you should also question the answers that we already have, because sometimes they're always partial. They're only partial answers. Newton and Einstein being perfectly good examples of this. So those would be my pieces of advice.
What would your father's advice be?
He celebrated failure as well as his successes in his students, and he wrote a synopsis on his every beginning class that would come in. He told them that they were just as responsible for everything that happened in that lab as he was, and that they were to ask the questions. He couldn't make the questions up for them. They had to think of them.
Anything to add?
I think it's been said.
All right, all right. Well,